If beige content feels forgettable, it's because, at a brain level, it usually is. Our next guest is here to explain why. Dr. Carmen Simon is a cognitive neuroscientist and chief science officer at Corporate Visions. She studies what the brain actually responds to and why emotion, story, and distinctiveness create memories where sameness doesn't. So, in this session, Carmen reveals what actually happens in the brain when content lands. She explains why neutral, generic messaging just gets forgotten and shows how simple shifts in contrast and emotion make your work far more memorable. Carmen, it's wonderful to have you here today. You've shown that people act on what they remember, not what they see in the moment. So, when we say beige content doesn't stick, what's actually happening in the brain when something fails to be remembered?
I like that question a lot because we've been talking about what constitutes good content. And from a neuroscience perspective and a business perspective, good content must be memorable content. And the reason for that is because memory influences decisions. Every single thing that you do, consciously or subconsciously, is based on what you remember, not on what you forget. And we're not making the proposition that every single piece of content must be memorable long term. Sometimes you're creating something and it's just for now and it is transitory content. But at some point, you are faced with a situation where you want something to linger and influence behavior in some way. In that case, you must develop memorable content. So then we ask the question, well, how do we know what is memorable and how do we create it? And from that standpoint, when I look to see how the brain reacts to that which is beige versus that which is not, in this case, you'll see how it's more literal than metaphorical. I typically use a combination of these biometric tools that you see in this image. In this case, the person who is wearing the gear is a buyer and he is in the market for a software solution. The content in this case is not really all that relevant to the conversation. Picture this to be your typical marketing created presentation that is designed for a commercial context.
Okay.
In this case, the presentation was delivered virtually. He's seeing the presenter that you're noticing in the upper right corner of the
Mm,
screen.
okay.
So on his scalp, I have an EEG cap. EEG stands for an electroencephalogram signal. This just simply means that as you're faced with a stimulus, your brain creates various brain waves that differ in terms of amplitude and frequency. And then we look to see where some of those frequencies appear in the brain, and we associate those with some cognitive processing like attention and motivation to keep going and how fatigued I'll know how fatigued he gets and I'll know if in some parts the that content has more of a cognitive workload versus in other parts. So there are some cognitive variables, and then of course there are some affective variables. So on his chest, I have an electrode for an electrocardio signal, an electrocardiogram. If this is something that you've done in a hospital, if you've ever had an EKG, it's this exact same
Yeah,
signal,
yeah.
except they call it by the sexier German name. So we have an EEG, we have an ECG signal on the wrist and the fingers. You're seeing another device called a GSR. This stands for galvanic skin response. And
Okay.
that too measures an emotional arousal signal. You still don't know if the arousal is provoked by something that is positive or negative. And the same for the eye tracker, which is the fourth signal that I
Mm,
capture. So on the computer itself, there is an eye tracker. Sometimes I'll ask people to wear the actual glasses. And the reason for that is because typically you look to where you think. So there's a
mm,
connection between visual attention and cognitive processing. So it's this combination that enables us to get to implicit reactions from the brain and body to content. And before any experiment, no exception, which is why I love the name of your show so much, I ask people to look at either physically a beige wall or
love
a beige screen. And the reason for that is because I want to see a baseline of that brain. I want to see what the brain is like in an unstimulated state. So then we look to see if there are some statistically significant differences between that beige wall, that baseline, and the stimulus itself, the content itself. And quite often, we do not observe any statistically significant differences between the two, which means we have a lot of
Okay.
opportunities to beat the beige wall.
Do you think part of the problem with AI and automation is that it smooths away the very things our brains use as memory cues?
It's possible because if you're outsourcing too much of your power and too many of your skills to the machine, and that machine has already been based on that which is by nature average, then what you get back is very close to that beige wall. So, one thing that we have to clarify though is that the beige wall and beige content in general as a metaphor is not always bad. You still need some beige in order to enable something to stand out. Because if everything
Mm,
was vying for your attention, it was that vibrant, then nothing would stand out. So for a moment, we have to pay some compliments to the beige because it's sacrificing itself in order for some other things to be distinct. And as you're listening to this as a practical guideline, especially on your way to making content memorable, consider this then. What is something that you can sacrifice and assign to beige so that something else can indeed deviate from that pattern?
So, if some beige is necessary, what actually makes something more memorable? What are the elements that push the brain beyond the beige wall?
Yeah, let's get to some practical guidelines. So, we already talked about this notion of distinctive, of disruptive as one of the criteria. But by the time we finish the conversation, we can end up with a miniature checklist. Let's start from the premise that as completing all those studies that you're noticing using those tools, with no exceptions, I'm noticing that people forget after 48 hours 90% and quite often more of the content that they've been exposed to, regardless of how brilliant that content is, regardless of how balanced it is between beige and some other distinctive
Mm,
things. You're, for now, addressing human brains that have a fallible human memory. We haven't merged with that AI that you're just talking about just yet. So we have human memory that is fallible. And if we know that we forget so much, that's not really even the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that your audiences are going to forget a lot. And the little they remember, let's consider a metaphorical 10%, because sometimes you may go a bit beyond 10, not that often, quite often goes below. So
mhm,
that metaphorical 10% that tends to stay there long term is quite often random. So that means that if
okay.
you, with your content, you're trying to convince not just one person to remember what you have to say so that then they can act on what you have to say, but you're trying to convince groups of people, you can't afford random memory. Quite often, people won't decide in your favor because not every single person remembers the same thing. So when they come back and reconvene, one person will have taken away a 10% message from your content, another
Mm.
person will have taken another 10%, another person another message. So your aspiration is not just random memory, but unified memory. So as an umbrella message for our
Mm.
conversation, I want to convey this notion of control your 10%, be in charge of that, do not leave it to chance. So now that we have this overall proposition, control your 10%, what goes underneath that? Well, can control what you cannot clarify. So as you're starting
Mm.
to create some content, whether this is in writing, whether this is text and images, always, or a video, always ask the question, what is my 10% message? If you're really after memorable content, and if you're after behavioral change, then you must be, then clarify what you want to be memorable for. A lot of people aspire at memory, but not that many know what they want to be memorable for.
I mean, that's a really strong point. I mean, how do you decide what the 10% should be? If it's often random, how do you choose the part you want people to remember?
It's a strong question, and it's where you'll spend most of your effort because the question sounds easy in theory,
Mm.
clarify your 10%. In action, you must be prepared to exert some effort. For instance, in our company called Enhansive, we work with a lot of corporate customers. And quite often, those customers come from spaces that are very competitive because they want to use their content in order to beat the beige wall,
Mhm.
because your competition is going to show up with beige, and then you have beige and you have beige, and at some point you have to have a distinctive message. So we help them with that message. not only in phrasing it and framing it, but
Mm,
also then designing some assets that make that stand out. One such context is the space of construction and architecture, because those spaces are highly competitive. So let's just say that you are the owner of a hospital, you want to redo
mhm.
a wing of that hospital. So now you need a builder
Yeah.
and you need an architect to help you with that project. And there is no shortage of construction and architecture firms. You send out an RFP, a request for proposal. You get, let's just say, 10 responses back. From those 10, you will pick your top three. And those top three firms now show up in front of you with some content, with a formal presentation to convince you to move in their favor versus in other people's
Mm.
favor. So you'd better have a strong 10% message, because that decision is not going to be made right there in the moment. People walk away, and this is groups of people. This is not just one person you have to convince. They will walk away to deliberate, and that deliberation period takes a few weeks, if not sometimes months. So you have
Mm,
to be memorable for that long in order for people to ultimately say, I still remember that bit much better than this other bit. So I'll give you an example of a 10% message that we just created, which would have been very strong in one context, not so strong in another, because you asked a good question. How do you come up with that 10% message? So for this instance, we are helping this company to win the a yes from the company Louis Vuitton. Have you heard of Louis Vuitton? You know that
yep,
brand. So
yep,
Louis
very nice.
Vuitton wants to come here to California, and not to any place but Beverly Hills, and in Beverly Hills, not on any street but Rodeo Drive, to
Of
build
course.
not one but two buildings.
2
One building
buildings.
would be two buildings. One would be for your typical retail, and one would be for exhibition and entertainment space. For
Wow.
that, they've already selected their architect, which is Frank Gehry. But for those listeners who don't know Frank Gehry, go to any search engine, type in the name, and you will see this structures that just defy gravity, because he's doing with steel things that you didn't know steel was possible of doing. And Louis Vuitton, of course, wants to work with some of
Mhm,
the most prominent architects already beyond the beige. So now they need a construction company. So, what was our 10% message for that setup? Because you're now partnering with brands like Louis Vuitton and the Frank Gehry's of the world, the promise that we made is that we will build like the world is watching. That was the main message, because we recognize that we're building on a site that defines elegance, for a
mhm.
brand that defines exclusivity, with an architect that defies geometry. This will become one of the most watched construction sites on the planet. So when you say build like the world is watching, you're always instilling this confidence that things will go smoothly. Things will go in such a way that as the world is watching, because every single architect, every single fashion designer, every single engineer will want to see how the Frank Gehry design will play such a big role in such a prominent spot. So as we talk about criteria for a strong 10% message, what's behind that? We looked for a message that has cognitive ease. Build
Mhm.
like the world is watching doesn't come to the brain in a heavy kind of way. The words roll off the tongue. It has a very strong reward, because you're protecting the ego in this case.
Mhm. I mean, you've talked before about surprise, that the brain pays attention when something feels slightly new, but not too new. Is surprise an important part of the 10%?
Yeah, let's talk about this notion of surprise for a moment, because it is a strong skill to have, that of developing an element of surprise and controlling it, because you don't want to be all that surprising all the time. And why is that? Because the brain, here we are talking about AI, and it's here to
Mm,
stay, and its predictive power. Everybody talks about that. But the most advanced, at least for now, predictive engine on the planet is still the brain. A brain that doesn't
mm,
predict what happens next with a fair amount of accuracy is not a brain that can survive. So we're constantly sharpening our analysis of the environment. We're constantly looking to see what's likely to happen next, what will happen next. From the brain's perspective, the most important thing is what happens next. So, if we look at the element of surprise, biologically speaking, surprise is always bad for the brain. And why is
Okay.
that? Because what is surprise but a failure to predict what happens next?
Interesting.
I remember an image that showed initially an eggshell, and then the eggshell gets broken, and instead of what you would expect to come out of there, you see this little pug. You know those tiny little cutesy
Yes.
dogs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So eggshells you've seen before, pugs you've seen before, but that combination you may not necessarily have seen before. So, therefore, an element of surprise. You didn't predict what would happen next.
Mm,
And even though, biologically speaking, we don't necessarily like surprises, we welcome them because the difference between what happens and what the brain expects is how the brain learns. And the learning brain, very much like we have machine learning, a
mhm,
learning brain is definitely one that also survives. So, as you're thinking about surprises, consider them, first of all, in moderation, because think of it this way: too much familiarity and too much beige, and your
mm.
content is boring. Too many surprises and your content is weird and very heavy to the brain, is like now you're just provoking almost too much tension. So find a good proportion between these two pillars. And when it comes to a 10% message, should it in itself have an element of surprise? Perhaps a slight twist to the familiar, but don't put so much pressure on yourself. I would recommend using elements of surprise right before your 10% message,
Okay.
which is one that has some familiarity, which is one that makes logical sense, is not one that will shake your world so much that you don't want to really go there. But one of the reasons people don't remember and don't act is because they're not prepared to pay attention. They're not in a ready state. So, with an element of surprise, you get the brain in a ready state. And then, as a result, what you say next has the chance to be memorable. I remember this lawyer starting her presentation with something around the minions. You
Yeah.
know, the minions?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that contrast between a lawyering like context and the cutesiness of the silliness of the minions was so sharp that now we are in a ready state. We did not predict that this lawyer is going to go up there and start with that. So you see, sprinkle these some of these elements of surprise, which will not be very easy to find, by the way. But when you find
Mm.
them, treat them like a treasure and prime the brain right before you share your 10% message.
You said emotion is a gateway to memory. With AI able to mimic tone and empathy synthetically now, what emotions still feel real to the brain, and what can it actually detect?
I like that question a lot because in just recently in a neuroscience study, I was looking at this concept of active listening. And in that case, you know how I showed you a picture of what a person is wearing
Yeah.
during my neuroscience studies, and in some of them, I have one person at a time who's interacting with a piece of content. More recently, with an AI tool, by the way, or
Okay.
seeing AI generated content, but it's one person at a time. In this active listening, I did something that is very convoluted to do, by the way, in neuroscience, and logistically a nightmare, which is to have pairs wearing the gear. And the reason why you sometimes want to go there and adopt what's called a hyper scanning technique, meaning that you're scanning more than two or more people at a time, is because you're looking to see when the two brains synchronize. And the reason you might want to see some synchronization between the two or more brains is because typically that's associated with better collaboration, better cooperation. Quite often, that's because of shared understanding of the same content,
Mhm.
and that's desirable for a lot of commercial contexts. So, in this active listening study, you had a seller and a buyer wearing the gear. So, I was looking to see when the two brains were synchronized between the two and when some active listening was happening. But active listening in itself is such an esoteric term. I had to ask, like, what really is active listening? Is it just simply paying attention? Is it eye contact? Is it just shared pain? Because if you have a spouse, you know for sure that sometimes you pretend to be listening while you don't really want to be listening. So I had a very hard time defining things. And as a scientist, you really don't want to go into a situation without defining your terms carefully. So I looked for moments where active listening could be a sign of. And as I was investigating other literature, what are some moments where active listening can appear? Like, for instance, empathy. You mentioned empathy
Mm,
just moments ago. Some literature is associating active listening with empathy. What were some other ones? When somebody elaborates on something, that too might invoke some active listening because you're sharing some details. What else could be active listening? Some other scientists were saying that when you affirm somebody else's situation, like you're saying, oh, you're not alone, that means you will have actively listened to what they said and you're concluding that their situation is not unique. In sales, that often happens when a buyer says, oh, we're struggling with XYZ, and the seller would
mm,
say, well, you're not alone in this. So affirmation was also one of the aspects of active listening. And the fourth one that I studied was insight. That surprised me because some people are equating the moment that you share an insight with somebody else's brain, they would consider that to be an increase in active listening because now you're a little bit perhaps more curious. So you're leaning in a little bit more. And of the four, so now we have affirmation, you're not alone. We have empathy. I can see how that would have been hurtful for you. You have an insight, giving some amazing statistics and some
mhm.
trends around something and providing a different way of thinking. And then also you have elaboration. Out of the four, I noticed that the touchy-feely ones actually don't work. So it's not so much about just using automation just because you can, it's fixing your workflows first and
Mm.
then automating that which works. And when you work with our company, the vendor was saying, we are enabling you to automate just the right workflow so that you can increase your automation efforts and decrease the amount of errors by 90% or whatever their proposition was. So you had a strong insight, and that ignites a reaction. It's like, oh, I didn't recognize that I had the wrong workflows. And of course, elaboration, then you're adding a few more details around that. I suspect that works because, with no exception, I'm noticing in my neuroscience studies that the brain synchronizes better with that which is complex, not that which is simple. Sometimes we give in to these simple emotions like anger or fear or
Mm.
even excitement or joy. You don't always have to go negative, but those are fairly on the surface. If you start digging a little bit more deeply and you elaborate and you offer insight, the emotion will still be there, but it'll be longer lasting.
I mean, that's really interesting, and there's a bit of surprising insight too, isn't there? I mean, when you introduce something unexpected or a perspective people haven't considered before.
Yes, and now we come all the way around to that element of surprise that you're taking the brain out of its predictable state, out of its beige state, and with a solid insight, which will in itself take a lot of work, by the way. Not all just factual information is insightful information. Sometimes
Mm,
facts parade with confidence, and we feel like, oh, then therefore they'll come across as insightful. You have to have at least a combination of stats. You have to
mm.
have at least one moment of cause and effect. You're saying, because this is happening, because you're automating the wrong things, then you have these workflows that end up in manual errors. So a good insight will always have cause and effect, which, if you're only listing a bunch of facts and there is no cause and effect between those, they don't get you to a better story. That pivot point that you're noticing is the way to a better story.
I mean, taking all of that, what are some practical things brands or individuals could do to make their social content more insightful and more memorable, especially on LinkedIn?
Yeah, if we go just for this notion for a moment of insightful content, which because of its stronger emotional appeal then can turn into memorable content, start looking for trends and challenges is one way. It's not the only way, but one way is to start looking for some trends, some challenges, some observations that you're making in your field or a context that is important to your audience. Look for patterns or connections between those trends and factual information, and challenge yourself to then establish a cause and effect. Through some testing, you may see if that cause and
Mm.
effect is really true, like this thing really causes this other thing to happen. And the moment that you can claim that causality, and causality can be very sexy in memorable content, that's when you're on your way to insightful and a stronger emotional content that you're sharing.
I just want to pick up on that word attention. I mean, people talk a lot about shrinking attention spans. What's actually changing, and what can marketeers do differently to earn attention today?
Well, here's the good news. The good news is that with neuroscience, we can debunk a myth. And that myth is so prevalent that I'm hoping that in light of our conversation right now, people question it all the time. And that myth is that we have a short attention span. Human beings do not have a short attention span. We cannot afford a short attention span if the ultimate goal is survival. We have what we need to pay attention for a prolonged amount of times. You don't even have to work in neuroscience to know this is so. You just have to be honest with yourself when you're wondering, what's the longest amount of hours I have binge watched on a TV show? And notice how do you have, by the way, a favorite show that you can just watch for hours on end?
I mean, loads of them. I mean, Game of Thrones, for example. You can
Yeah,
watch.
so imagine Games of Thrones is so popular, but globally popular, and I'm glad that you're mentioning it, and people are on it for hours on end. This is not seconds on end, which is why it bothers us when people popularize articles like human beings have the attention span of a goldfish. First of all, I would have loved to be part of that study that looked at the attention span of goldfish, because that would be interesting. But as human beings, we are capable, just know this, we are capable of staying with a stimulus as long as that stimulus is important enough and or interesting enough, ideally a combination. And sometimes, especially with business content, those two criteria are not there. Sometimes things are just simply not that interesting, and sometimes they're not all that important. So
Mm,
therefore, we have other things to watch and go do and look at. So, knowing that there is good news, then we ask the question, how do we make something interesting and or important? We've already talked about a few criteria. For example, finding something that is rewarding to the brain. That's a very strong question to ask. What's rewarding to their brain, not to your
mhm.
brain? Finding something that comes to the brain easily. You don't have to strain yourself in order to be part of that situation. For instance, one other message that we came up with for we're talking about construction. Choose the team with deja vu, because what does a project owner want? They typically want somebody with expertise
Mhm.
and somebody who has been in those types of projects before. So you're not just saying choose the expert team, you're saying choose the team with deja vu. I know you live in France, so for you, that message comes to mind very easily. Uh, so you see how you're just giving the brain just a small amount of a desirable difficulty where you have this very brief aha moment. By the way, with those tools that I showed you, we are able to calculate a eureka effect. So we will be able to see at what point through a sequence does the brain have that aha moment. When you have it, it's
Mm,
more likely that you'll have a stronger electrochemical signal, a stronger emotion. Not all the time, but
mhm.
most of the time that is associated with long-term memory. So look to see as you're creating things, you have beige, 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 and then every so often, can you have that little eureka effect of, oh, I didn't really know this, or I haven't really looked at it that way before.
I mean, in the B2B world, when so much marketing is quite dull, color palettes, tone, formats, if we go right to the heart of this, what's the one thing B2B marketeers could do to make their content more memorable and less beige this week?
This week, or even as early as this afternoon. Let's
Yes.
let's let's go for that. Well, here's the good news. The good news is that your content by itself is never beige. It's never boring. There's something that you can do to always rescue it. On the surface, it may be like, could there be really such a sexy thing in governance processes, for instance, and
Mm,
data analysis in general? You can rescue any beige, you can rescue any content. So, for example, we are working with a company in the space of governance processes.
mhm,
There was this software tool that you can use, especially for board members or executive teams, in order for to be kept in check because sometimes leaders of a company will go out there. You're talking about LinkedIn messages or some
Mm.
popular social media platforms, and they will post something or they will say something publicly, and that content will now spread, and they get themselves and their companies in so much trouble. So there has to be some governance that just keeps these
Yeah.
processes in check and these luminaries in check. So how do you rescue a governance presentation, for instance? Well, go for practical examples that people can relate to, and those elements you'll be able to see in your environment later on. So for example, we are giving some stories about the CEO of Lululemon. You're familiar with that brand,
Mhm.
who said a
Mhm.
few things and got himself in trouble. The CEO of Boeing said a few things, got himself in trouble.
Mm.
The CEO of
Okay.
United Airlines said a few things, got himself in trouble. So you're bringing in all of those very concrete, very specific examples. You're also mentioning some brands that later on act as cues to memory, because the next time you're going to walk by a Lululemon store, you'll be reminded, oh, so that's I can remember that story that I heard. Or next time you're
Mm.
on an airplane, Boeing is so prevalent, you'll be reminded of that story and that concept. So a few practical guidelines from here, you can apply these as early as the show is over. Look to see how many concrete things are you really associating with your beige content, and can they be part of something that people see in their reality when you're no longer in the room? Because memory doesn't just happen out of the blue. Like, you're not sitting at your
Mm.
desk thinking, I'm going to now recollect everything that I read from that content. Usually something happens in your reality and it reminds you of something, which then reminds you of something else. So associate your content with something that is prevalent as a cue, and then your memory is going to live that much longer.
Could you give me an example of how that might work?
Yeah, so when we were saying that in your governance processes, we are
Mm.
associating that with United Airlines, with Boeing, with
Mm.
Lululemon, because those segments are so prevalent in your own reality. When you move away from your computer, you're likely to see those segments.
Mm.
That's how you're looking for cues that are prevalent in people's environments, and they don't even have to be as big as, for instance, brand names. I remember we were doing a presentation once. We were noticing that the company that was creating the presentation was after some behavior change, and they were always having in this little kitchen area a bunch of oranges. Like, anytime we showed up at the office, those oranges were present there. So in the presentation itself, we built it around this orange motif and an actual physical orange. And we also applied a slight sense of humor. Like, for instance, there was this orange that was peeling itself, and the more that it was taking layers, it was reflecting on something that was quite philosophical.
Okay.
But that orange, then anytime, and that presentation was over, but then anytime you walk by those bowl of oranges, you always kept that in mind. It's like, oh, that reminds me of that little orange that was peeling itself. So look to see what in your audience's environments could remind them of you and your content and your message.
And this links right back to what you said earlier, the 10%, the thing they're most likely to remember, yeah?
Yes, ideally you associate then your 10% message with that.
Carmen, thank you very much. That was a fascinating look under the hood. You've given us a scientific backing for something many of us feel intuitively, that emotion and story aren't nice to haves, that how the brain decides what's worth keeping. That's a powerful argument against beige.